Welcome to Why Water Content Can't Tell You Everything and 8 Other Research Ruining Mistakes. I'm Dr. Colin Campbell, a senior research scientist at Meter Group and also adjunct faculty in the Department of Crop and Soil Sciences at Washington State University. And I'm excited to be here with you today and hope that I can give you some things for you to think about as you do field research. But I have to tell you a story as we begin. As a 12-year-old, I joined many of my friends on a winter hike into a snowbound cabin near the top of a beautiful mountain. After a fantastic afternoon of sledding, our soaking wet group of boys trudged back to the icy cabin and hurried to build a fire to keep warm and dry out. With the fire built, we continued to add logs so that we could be comfortable, but way overshot the mark. Soon the cabin was sweltering, and instead of relaxing in the glowing warmth, we were overheated and sweating. The fire was so hot that some of the boys' boots melted as they dried on the hearth. In an attempt to cool down, we let the fire die and were soon shivering with the cold and struggling to stoke up the fire again. Clearly, we were missing a fundamental understanding of how many logs we needed to add to keep the fire in a place where it would make us comfortable in the cabin. A professor named Warren S. Johnson from Wisconsin in the United States had a similar problem in the late 1800s. Finding the janitor to add logs or coal to the fire to keep his students warm was an imprecise and time-consuming process. And instead of trying to calculate how much heat to add by knowing how much heat coal contains, the size of his room, and how much heat there was there already, he simply invented a thermostat. This invention simply used temperature and a bell when the temperature got below a certain mark to alert the janitor down in the basement to add more coal when the room began to be cold. This 1883 invention was the primary product of Johnson Controls at the time, a company that actually still exists today. So, soil, water, and plant growth have many parallels to these stories. It is easy to make assumptions about how much water is in the soil in terms of how much plants need to grow to be comfortable in that soil, or how little water will cause them to go into stress. If we monitor the amount of water in the soil with a water content sensor, then we should know how much is required to keep them comfortable in their optimum range. Well, there's a problem. Although knowing how much water is in the soil is important, it's still similar to this issue of how many logs we need to add to the fire to keep us comfortable. The problem has a pretty simple answer, that we need to know more about the energy state in the soil, just as Professor Johnson needed more understanding of the energy state in his room to control the temperature. Water potential is a far less familiar term to many people, but it is analogous to temperature. It defines the water availability comfort range of plants in the same way that temperature defines the comfort range for humans. Simply put, it is the thermometer for plants. And I've had someone draw this for me. I got great help from Alexa Black, who drew these figures for me and tried to illustrate some of these concepts. While the definition may be a little complex to understand, comfort ranges are well established for plants. So there's no absolute need to deeply understand the concept of water potential to get the benefit out of using it, just like for temperature. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about that really needs to be measured as we go out in the field and make measurements is water content and water potential together. And the problem is that people often only make one soil moisture measurement, and usually deferring to soil water content because these are pretty simple. Without water potential, sites are often difficult to compare. And I can tell you that I had this experience where you measure 25% at one location and 22% in another location. Can we say that one site is drier than the other? Well, if we were talking about the heat content in a room, we couldn't say really. We need to turn it to the temperature to say if one was more comfortable than the other. And the same thing is for soil. It happens for soil water status. The only way we can compare two sites is to look at the energy state. So without water potential, we won't know how to compare them. And finally, we lack information on water stress that can help lead to ambiguous conclusions. I've been to several posters in the past where the students have been looking at drought stress in certain plants for an ecological analysis. And to get that plant stress, they told me they were lifting the pots to determine which pot weighed more and which weighed less. Well, that is an interesting way to approach it, but it doesn't tell us absolutely about stress. So the solution is become familiar with the units of water potential and the ranges of water potential, and then combine together water content and water potential to get a complete soil moisture picture. And I just want to talk about this a little bit. So again, do you need to understand temperature to use it? Temperature has several units: degrees C, Kelvin, Fahrenheit, but typically we only connect these values to comfort. So in the United States, for example, we understand the Fahrenheit scale, but have a more difficult time understanding whether something in Celsius would be comfortable. Like, hey, is 35 degrees Celsius, is that comfortable? Well, it's hard for someone from the US to tell that. Vice versa, someone from outside the US, if we said, hey, it's 87 degrees outside, they wouldn't know whether you were going into an oven or if you were just needing a swimsuit and heading down to the local lake. So it's easy for us to remember these ranges if we're familiar with the units, and the same thing can be said for water potential. Water potential has all these comfort ranges worked out. Here's an old text from 1972, so it's been a long time, where Sterling Taylor and others worked out these comfort ranges of water potential for a lot of agronomic crops you can see here. Specifically, I'm highlighting potatoes, for example, that has a range of -30 to -50 kilopascals. Well, what is that range? You might be stressed to really not understand what a kilopascal is and how we relate that to other things. But look at the thermometer there on the left-hand side. The green portion, the comfort range, goes from 20 to 100, with more specifically -30 to -50. Sorry, I missed the negative units on there. Shoot, got to put those in there. Those should be negative. And from -20 to -100, that's a typical plant optimal range for many types of plants. And if we memorize the scale, we don't have to be too worried about the other details. So why isn't water potential used more commonly? Well, people say it's difficult to understand. It's hard to measure. And even when using water potential, we don't know how much water to add. We just know that there's a lack of comfort for the plants. So let's look at these each specifically. So I just wanted to show this. If we look at temperature and really dig deep into what temperature is, it's defined by the third law of thermodynamics with respect to absolute zero. And your eyes may be glazing over at this point. Well, let's forget about that. We don't need to know all of that to make use of this scale. We simply learn, as I mentioned, the relevant temperature units and scale, and attempt and accept these values as for optimal ranges. So the same thing should be said for water potential. If we want to dig down into that, it's the energy required per unit quantity of water, blah, blah, blah. We've got virtual seminars on the Meter Group site that you can learn all about that. But if you don't want to learn about it, simply learn the relevant water potential scales, -20 to -100 kilopascals for most crops, and accept literature values for these optimal ranges, and then we're good to go. We don't have to understand the deep principle of water potential to really be able to use it effectively. The next thing is water potential is hard to measure. That's traditionally been true. It's not super simple. And yet, as technology advances, that's changed a lot. And for Meter Group, we've developed a sensor called the Teros 21 that overcomes these challenges. Each of these sensors is individually calibrated, so we don't get the poor sensor-to-sensor variation of other sensors that are out there or that have been built in the past. And we can see this sensor consistency that's evident in a couple of different experiment sites. Here's just a field capacity over 7 different fields that are located several kilometers apart here in this study. And again, in this study, this was in the same field, but several hundred meters between each sensor. And we see both of these situations, the sensors start very, very close together, which is pretty impressive. So the other thing we talked about was water potential lacks connection to how much water is in the soil. And that's true. It only tells you what the energy state is, just like that temperature. Temperature won't tell you how much heat you need to add. It will just tell you whether there's enough energy in the room to make it comfortable for you. But let's consider some scenarios. First, a decent scenario, simply using water potential to know when plants are in stress, and then a great scenario where we use both water potential and water content together to get a complete moisture picture. So this is an experiment we ran with several sites, several locations across a large area, where you can see the water contents didn't change much across the season. This was in a clay loam soil. And we were just right at the beginning of stress point as we moved through the season at some sites and got into serious stress at others. So bottom right here, we have a graph of water potential across the season. We specifically call that matrix potential, one subset of water potential. And here's our water content. So not much change here, only 3% at any site over the season. We might assume that everything's all right in that soil, but when we turn to matrix potential, we see that several of those sites got through the stressed range and even into the wilting range. And so we see some problems out there in this field that we never would have seen had we just been focusing on water content. And even water content didn't really tell us much in this particular experiment. But here's another experiment we ran on turf grass. This is a finer textured soil, or a coarse textured soil. This is a sandy loam. And in this sandy loam, we combined both water potential here, the matrix potential. There should be another negative here. Sorry, I left that out. And here on the water content, this is percent on the y-axis. And we see in this graph a situation where we drop into the comfort range right here of that plant. So it's not too wet, not too dry. So too dry is down here, too wet is up here. And then we have this perfect range that we scoped out using these two things together, where we have the soil is full of water and the soil down here is really empty of water. It's not accessible to the plants anymore. And if we do a little analysis, this had turf grass growing on top, so the root zone was only 15 centimeters deep. This is a little more complicated from this discussion, but 12 millimeters of irrigation would fill up this profile. So first rule, add water potential to your study. Don't just go with water content, because it tells you so much more about the comfort level of your plant. So the next one, failing to collect enough metadata. My father always told me that the shortest pencil is longer than the longest memory. And when you get out to the field, you are not going to be feeling like writing stuff down, but man, is it important later. I've had several manuscripts we've been writing that we needed details on that we just didn't remember, or we lost the notebook. This is painful. We don't remember where sensors were installed, or we don't remember what sensors are where when we buried them through the ground. Some solution to this: brainstorm everything you want to know before you go out to the field, and utilize those friends. Ask them to review your ideas. They will tell you what you're missing, and you're going to have a lot more success in the field. Keep a site notebook, or even better, keep an eSite notebook, or a site e-notebook. Be rigorous in your note taking. Make sure you collect all the information and do it right there in the field. Don't wait. I will tell you that nothing is very easy to remember after a long field day when you're back in the office and you're like, okay, I need to write down all these things. No, you're not going to remember. Record things like how deep your sensors were buried, and then go ahead and store that in the cloud where other people can find it. This is our e-notebook. This is just on a Google worksheet, on Google Sheets. You can see a lot of details there. You can pause this recording and look at it if you want. I'm not going to go into it, but here's sheet where we're keeping all the details of every site visit we made. And here are the details of our install with depths and other things, sensors we installed, serial numbers, et cetera, et cetera. Also when we replaced instruments in the field and upgraded them. You can also store these metadata in the cloud. Meter Group has a software called Zentra Cloud, and there we can store sensor depths, serial numbers, firmware, all these things that we might be able to use later. Another great thing is site pictures. This is kind of a cool scenario we used back last winter on the Wasatch Plateau at 10,000 feet, 3,000 meters in Utah. We have a game camera at each one of these sites, and we just get to observe these things. Look, when snow comes on or off, we even get to tell snow depth. We marked on a little stand to the right there depths. Eventually, the snow got so deep it buried our marking stick. Okay, number 3, installing sensors in the wrong place to test the hypothesis. The problem is, how do you know you're in the right spot? And with sensors they're in situ kind of point measurement sensors, this is a big challenge. So how do we solve this problem? Well, one of the things that we've been working on lately is historical satellite data. This is a great start to this. We look at the past 5 years of normalized difference water index, for example, although you could use many, many other indices that might be appropriate to what you're doing. You look at those data and look for the things that you're interested in. For us, the normalized difference water index showed us the average location in the field in terms of water use, the driest part, the wettest part. And so we could locate our sites in places that were statistically interesting. You can also do this with soil sampling. We've done really intense sampling in fields. I've been associated with at least 2 projects that have sampled over 100 times in a 30 to 40 hectare field. That's a lot of sites. It's a lot of energy involved, but you can do that, and it gets you data that you can compare statistically. You can look at other things. If you're doing an agronomic field, you can look at yield. You can actually talk to people who are familiar with the area to draw out detailed diagrams of the experiment and to help you to make sure that you understand what the goals are and what you're trying to accomplish. So here's an example. This is an agronomic example. It can be applied to a lot of different things, and we're in the process of doing this, whether it's a native field, like some of my sites are, or even in a golf course. We're trying to do it there to try to save irrigation water. You can go to the satellite and to find these points. So again, as I mentioned, NDWI out here, and we're looking at average moisture. You see red dots out there. Those are the driest moisture locations across seasons. There, we actually ended up installing at the average moisture, and it worked extremely well. I was really impressed with that. Okay, failing to add lab data to get a complete picture. You know, I don't know how many times you've done this, but this for me has been a challenge. You don't have enough information to fully characterize the experimental site in your paper. So you get down to the materials and methods section, and you're trying to write it, and you suddenly realize, well, what soil type was that? You need to know that, and you need to know something about the moisture release characteristics of the soil, meaning just as I talked about earlier with water potential and water content, if we're measuring some kind of water potential, how does that correlate with water content or vice versa? That also helps you understand the hydraulic conductivity, the air entry point, and other critical things about your soil. But don't forget about soil type. You're going to need that to publish your paper, but also to really interpret sensor behavior. If you're measuring things in the soil, often sensors tell you things you're not expecting, and you better have data along with that soil data to try to be able to understand what's actually going on. So here's a little lab testing equipment. These are things that I used on some of my experiments. So on the right-hand side, this is called the Pario. This is an instrument to get the sand, silt, and clay fraction, to also give you the soil type that you're using depending on your location, and different countries have different ways to assess that. On the left-hand side, this is an instrument called HYPROP, and this gives you your moisture release curve for your soils. Number 5, not installing enough sensors to capture variability. Oh, how many times has this been a problem for me? So you get out in the field, you install a couple sites, your budget's limited, so you can't buy any more instruments than you have, and the correlations that you're wanting to get to, they lack statistical significance. This happened to me not too long ago up at the same plateau site. We took, I think, 2 years so far of data looking at water potential and the water content up on the plateau of different sites. So we had a leeward site, a windward site, and a summit site where we were trying to compare moisture regimes and consider the impacts to the native plants, especially the trees, and that were growing in the area. We just didn't have enough sensors out there because we didn't have the budget for it. And so when you get to trying to write up the experiment, the graduate student who was working on it said, hey, I simply don't have enough sensors to be able to make the correlations we need to get this published. So we put more sensors out there. Hopefully we'll get to where we can publish it, but don't make that mistake. Prepare a robust instrumentation budget when you're going to the field. And then if you run out of that money, use other sources of data. Satellites do really well for supporting data. Drones for remote sensing. This is used much, much more frequently now. Soil sampling. In one of my research sites I mentioned, we had over 100 samples out in the field, and these provided important connections with only 6 sites out in the field to actually make continuous measurements on. So spend a little time carefully considering the experimental design, and you should be able to be all right in this. Okay, number 6, failing to review data regularly. Oh my gosh. You see this list, it can go on and on. I could spend the next hour talking about this. The problems are you don't see the issues coming, whether something crops up with a sensor, the data are on the server, but you don't look at them until the end of the season. The statistics you run at the end of the season, you can't run, adjustments aren't possible. Like I mentioned, if you need another sensor there, the logger batteries die, good data are not understood. So you're looking at data, but you don't understand that it's actually not good because you don't understand what good looks like. The data are out on the logger for an occasional download, and you're just not looking at them. Key sampling moments are missed, like emergence flowering, senescence, other things. I mean, this is so typical. And one of the reasons I love having a camera out in the field, or even mice chew through wires. How many times does that happen? I think I heard it mentioned 3 times today in a symposium I was in. Okay, what are the solutions? Use cloud-based visualization software. So I've got a little visualization graph down there. This is one I use from the Wasatch Plateau on a regular basis right now as we're coming into winter in the Northern Hemisphere. I'm looking at battery voltage. So that's from last year. I was on top of that. Actually, it was from last spring. And you can see a couple of the systems are losing batteries very quickly. The reason they are is that they were buried under that snow I showed you a little bit earlier. And so there was no solar charging going on. That was a real pain. We ended up getting up there and replacing the batteries. We got the data out because the loggers will store data even if they're not transmitting out. But it meant that we couldn't see this continuous data coming out. So graph the data like you expect to see. Use an API and put the data into your favorite software. So a lot of these systems like ZentraCloud have an API that you can just get them straight into R, MATLAB, Excel, whatever your thing is, Python. You can use that and you can get data out easily. And set up alerts. So in this system, for example, that blue square there, actually right here, whoops. Mouse is jumpy. Right here, that actually sent me an alert by email to say, hey, you've dropped below your lower level of 40% battery. You need to pay attention. So these things are really good. I love the alerts most of all because that means I don't have to do much and the thing is reaching out to me. So here's a graph that I looked at, and this is again from last winter into the spring. I had a water content sensor that was doing really crazy stuff, and it made me wonder if there was a problem with the sensor. But I was actually watching along with this sensor during the winter. I never visited the site, but I was watching along to see if I needed to make a trip out to the field to reinstall the sensor or replace it during that time, because it just wasn't making any sense. Then I actually graphed the temperature data there, and all the significant drops in the water content were actually due to freezing events in that soil. And water content sensors typically use dielectric measurements, charge storing capacity, and ice has a different charge storing capacity, about 5, than liquid water does, which is about 80. So whenever it froze, it disappeared to the sensor, and that is what's causing all those jumps in the sensor. So I was happy to know that and stopped worrying about the site. Okay, number 7, losing data. The problem is the data stored on field loggers, on local drives, or obscure servers, they are easily lost. And I will tell you that we have heard sob stories here at Meter Group and also at our partner company, Campbell Scientific. We hear this all the time. The local hard drive isn't backed up and it fails. There was a catastrophe at the site. Just heard one of those today. The logger was flooded and it washed away. No more data. Or an animal savages the system and the logger is not recoverable. Or especially in the tropical regions or certainly in the warmer regions, ants attack the electronics. When I was a graduate student, we opened up our box down in Corpus Christi, Texas in the USA, and it was absolutely packed full of ants. Luckily, they didn't actually kill any of the electronics. We got it early because we were visiting the site pretty regularly, but boy, that was not very fun. So you also back up data to an unknown server somewhere, on the school's drive or whatever, can't find it. Or the student moves on and takes all the system knowledge. That happened to a friend of mine who's running a lot of TDR sensors and had this great graduate student. And then the student moved on and they were, what next? They didn't know how to run it. So solutions for this: save data on the cloud with shared folders for all the stakeholders. Make sure everybody has access. Or even better, use a cloud-based system so you can all easily find it, interact with it, and download data wherever you are in the world. And really think about this mantra. Hardware can be replaced, data cannot. So at Meter Group, we've often had the saying that data are king, and you should think about that too. Make sure those data are somewhere where you can access them. Okay. Number 8, failing to install sensors properly. This is a big deal. Getting out to and installing sensors improperly dooms experimental findings. I've seen this a lot. Be careful. Many assume that they know how to install sensors properly. They don't make good soil contact. They don't level their systems. They leave protective covers in place. This compromises the data. Because you will have problems when you go to analyze data if you miss out on this. The experimental realities are out there. We have rocky soils. We have challenges going down to the depths we want to. There's a picture up on the Wasatch Plateau, one of my research sites. You can see in the bottom, there's enough stones in that soil. We simply couldn't dig any deeper. It just wouldn't move. We needed a backhoe. So instead of installing at 30 centimeters like we wanted, or at 60 centimeters, I don't remember, we had to go more shallow. And it's hard, sometimes it's just hard. You face these challenges. You have to be able to be pretty dynamic in the field and make choices that really embrace experimental realities. And it's sometimes hard to install met stands above ground. The soil's rocky, hard to get them in, hard to get them level. The solution to this is use an installation tool. And sometimes in those difficult soils, these tools can reach to the depth quickly that we want. It won't take us as much time. They compress the sensors into soil consistently, meaning you'll have a good solid installation instead of doing it by hand when you typically wiggle. This is for like water content sensors in holes. Use online aids. There's tons of stuff on the Meter Group website to show you how to install things and step-by-step guides. Also, reach out to support people. Meter Group has a ton of support people that are perfectly happy to help you. Our partner organizations, I know, keep a cadre of people around ready to support you in your efforts. And the final one here is forgetting to verify everything before leaving the install site. Things that seldom work the first time we do them, and field work is exhausting, so it's hard to take time to check, but you must do that. You must take the time to do it. There are often problems with understanding what range your sensor is supposed to read. So when you check them, you're like, oh, that's reading well. It reads negative 800. Well, is that a good reading? If it's a water content sensor, there's a problem. If the logger's not reading at the wrong interval, you're also out of luck. This has happened to me before. You're hurrying to get done with the experiment. It's starting to rain. It's starting to lightning over the hill. Prepare well and make sure to get this all connected and set up right. You can also forget to configure ports poorly, forget. You can also configure them poorly. This is something that's happened to me a few times where you're working through, you got a lot of sensors to install, you're trying to check well, but you don't do the configuration right. Solutions. Set up the system in the lab before going to the field. That's a great step. If you got everything working in the lab, it's going to go so well in the field. Do it. Take the time to do it. It will save you so much in the field, and it's usually not hot in your lab. Prepare a checklist of plausible readings for each sensor. So make sure you've written down what the sensor should read. So in the field, it's not a problem. Negative 800, does that fit the bill? Yeah, okay, it's a water potential sensor. It's reading in kilopascals and the soil's dry. That's fine. We can move on. Use a friend to check the values online to verify everything works. If you're updating to the cloud, like on ZentraCloud, you can just have people check the values. Then you don't have to take time to do it, and you can just call them on your cell phone to make sure everything's going well. When you go to the field, mentally plan time for verification. It's hard to do after an exhausting day in the field, but man, it will pay dividends. Plan on spending more time than you think. Remember, I was going to take my kids to go swim on a little vacation we were on. I was just helping some people with an install in a turf grass at a university, and what was supposed to be a noon install, I was done at 5 p.m. And the kids were sad. I was sad because I just really hadn't planned enough time to do it. Use the Bluetooth reader. There are those out there just to check individual sensor readings. Meter Group has a ZSC, it's called, and you can just use your smartphone to make sure each sensor is reading well. There it is. There's that ZSC right in the field. You can check that sensor reading. So useful just to make sure it's doing well. There's the cloud verification that you can just look and make sure readings are coming in over the cloud. And now we're to our summary. Things to remember. Only measuring water content for soil water status, that's going to be a challenge. You want to measure both to try to understand both the energy state of water in your soil and the amount of water. That's a really powerful combination. Second, data or research ruining mistake, failing to collect enough metadata. Very, very, very important that you make sure you're collecting the data that you want to at your research site while you're there, to like sensor depths, your weather station heights. All those things are going to be important as you write the paper and as you analyze things. Installing sensors in the wrong place to test hypothesis. Make sure that you use some of these other techniques available to get your sensors installed in the right place. Failing to add lab data to get a complete picture. So especially with soil, where we look at moisture release curves and need to know the soil type, make sure you're collecting those data as you go along. Take soil samples from the field as you're coming back. I promise you, if you have to throw those soil samples away, it's way better to do that than to not have them when you need them. Number 5, not installing enough sensors to capture variability. Make sure to prepare that robust budget and to use other things to create a good backdrop for your measurements in the field. Failing to review your data regularly, you can get into very difficult situations when data come through, and and you've missed something, and now it's been 2 months since it's been addressed. Store your data somewhere where everybody has access. Don't lose data. It's so easy to lose it and so simple to avoid. Number 8, failing to install sensors properly. Learn how to do that before you go to the field, and then you won't have a problem. And number 9, finally, forgetting to verify everything before leaving the installation site. Take the time, mentally prepare for the time, and do the verification so you don't have to make an extra run to the field, or you're not sitting there staring at data that don't make any sense after your experiments far along. I want to thank you for spending some time with me talking about these mistakes and how to fix them. I love field work. It's one of my favorite parts of my job, and I hope by talking about this, you will be able to help your research in the field go well. Thank you very much, everyone. Well, I hope you enjoyed that presentation. I'm joined here now by Leo Rivera, our marketing manager here at Meter Group. And there aren't any questions yet to answer. Feel free to drop some in to help us discuss things. But right off the bat, we're going to talk about data availability in the time of COVID and first talk about the Zentra Cloud system that I talked about there. Leo, you had a question. Do you want to go ahead?
Well, I think that's exactly what I wanted to hit on is, with current times, accessing sites has become actually more difficult, and staying on top of our data has been a challenge. And I thought it'd be great to discuss a little bit about how the improvements in technology for data access has made it more possible for us to keep up with our research even in these challenging times.
Yeah, so as we think of all the changes that have made it so we can do a lot of the things that we do normally off-site, one of the big things that I see, one of the critical things about research this year that's been different from other years is being able to access data from the field without actually going there. And I've heard it mentioned in several talks that were given as a part of AGU, the challenge of just getting to the field. And so one of the things that we found critical this year in our research was being able to access our data. The experiments I mentioned here in this talk, they're located a long way from Meter Group. They're in Utah and in Idaho, and we're located in the state of Washington here in the US. And so there really wasn't a possibility of making multiple site visits this year. We did get out once to do one site visit, but that's the sum total. So really all I was able to do this year was to follow along my data, and I just did it moments ago as the presentation was playing to see how things are going on my multiple sites and look at the sensor data. It's played a critical role in our ability to continue on our efforts this year despite not having to the field. So that's been crucial. So Holly says, for a study that is not irrigated and just wants to assess biological water availability, would a matrix potential sensor alone be sufficient over having a volumetric water content sensor? That's a great question. You want to talk about that, Leo?
Sure. When we're looking at biological availability of water, what we know is that matrix potential is our main indicator of that availability. And if we're not worried about how much water to add in terms of irrigation, I think it is the one sensor that you truly would need when trying to make those measurements. I think where you want to think about adding water content is if you need to know the amount of water that is changing, or if you need to know the amount of water that you need to add for irrigation purposes. But in terms of understanding biological availability, matrix potential is the true indicator there.
And I mentioned this in our discussion earlier. I've seen many studies, probably too many to count, where they put water content sensors out in the field, and then at some point we're attempting after the fact to compare two different locations. The challenge with doing that is that if you use water content, and you say one site has 30% water content and one says has 15, does that mean that the location that has 30% water content, is the water more available to the plants? And the answer to that question is no. We don't know. It could be, but I had a situation where some research was being done in some really mixed soils where we had some sand and some clay interspersed in a river bottom. And the measurements in the clay were really high. The measurements in the sand were really low just because of the soil type. And we couldn't make any assumptions about if the water was more available in one location than the other. Any thoughts on that, Leo?
No, I think that about sums it up. And I think one thing that I'd like to add here is that a lot of us here at Meter Group come from this field and are scientists, and this is one of our favorite things to talk about. I know I personally love talking about water potential as a whole. And when it comes to our previous research areas, this is an area that we really enjoy thinking about and trying to better understand. I don't know if you want to add to that, Colin.
Well, so one of the questions you may have is, why did we focus on water potential as a elongated section to this talk? And the only point that we're trying to make here is that essentially water potential, because of the challenge of the measurement, has been looked over for many, many years, and people have simply chosen to make their measurements using water content, mostly because it's a less challenging measurement to make. And I guess the take-home message we want to leave you with is that there are opportunities to do better in measuring soil and measuring water in soil. If we use water potential, we can compare sites, we can understand the movement of water within the soil, we can understand availability of water for whatever processes. And more we're seeing this used in the literature now that there are accurate sensors available. But I don't want that to overshadow our general discussion, which was of things that you need to do to make sure your field research goes well. Measuring water potential is the first piece of that, but there are a lot of other pieces that we mentioned today that we don't want to go without mentioning. Having tools in the field that upload to the cloud, critical. Taking time to just write things down or to analyze, to understand more things about your site so that you can use them later. These are critical things that we've seen really has caused problems with research over the years. Leo, any more questions that come up? We've got just a couple minutes left.
Oh, that's a good one. I think when I think about where we've come in terms of data access and data availability in the past 5 years, I think we've come a long way in improving that and making it easier to collaborate and share data with your collaborators. And I think now as we move towards larger scale projects, I think that becomes more important and in terms of being able to collaborate and share data. And I think that's been a heavy focus of ours. And I hope that it helps other researchers. I think we see it have an impact.
Yeah, it's one of our best tools we have during this pandemic is just easy data sharing. In Zentra Cloud, for example, this is something that my collaborators and I do quite a bit on these experiments is just see data, we share it immediately, people are looking at the data, and a lot more things go right when we're doing that. Well, we're up against our time limit. I would encourage you, if you've been watching, to come by the Meter Group booth. We've got people in the booth who are anxious to talk to you and to talk about your experiment, how we can see that go well. We're happy also to take individual emails with questions. My email is colin.campbell, colin.campbell @metergroup.com. Leo, also happy to take email at leo.rivera @metergroup.com. And we thank you for tuning in today.
Thanks for your time, everybody.